you extension small ruminant webinar session. We hold this webinar series every fourth Tuesday of the month. Thank you so much once again for joining us. And just a few things before I introduce Mark Kennedy today. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. And also, you may please kindly post your questions in the chat box. We're going to monitor that. And as Mark continues, we're going to make sure we endeavor to answer all the questions you may have, within the time frame that we have today. And without any further ado, we just want to dive into today's webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking on designing your sheep and goat grazing system. And I have the honor and privilege to have Mark Kennedy with us. Mark worked for NRCS for 10 years. He now runs Kennedy Grassland Services LLC. It's a privilege to have Mark with us today to share his thought on sheep and goat grazing system. Mark Kennedy, over to you today. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you, David. Start up with, as he said, I'm Mark Kennedy. I actually worked for NRCS for 35 years. I've been retired 10 years and contract back to do the fun part of my old job with grazing schools and workshops and field days and working with individual producers. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And designing a grazing system for sheep and goats is not that much different than designing it for any other type of livestock. There are going to be some differences. We'll get into that as we move on. One thing, I think everybody needs to have some goals and objectives for why they're doing what they're doing or wanting to make changes in their operation by putting in a grazing system. And the objectives that I listed, my objectives is to be able to manage the forage to meet the animal nutritional needs as many days as possible, to be able to maintain or improve the pasture condition and soil health, to be able to manage internal parasite levels, and to make a profit. So I'm coming at it from those standpoints. Some of my goals are what I try to do when I am grazing is divide the paddocks or the pastures into smaller units and have the animal get those smaller units to where they're in there a shorter period of time, and we allow them to take one large bite or mouthful off as many plants as possible in a pasture, but then we want to get them out of there before any regrowth occurs. That's where we start damaging our pastures. If our grazing periods are too long, the animals have the ability to do selective grazing, and they keep going back everywhere. If what they bit off on day one, by day 3 to day 5 is starting to regrow again, they'll go over there and bite that plant off again. And we just set it back because it didn't get a chance to replenish the carbohydrates lost in that first bite. So keeping those grazing periods short and then the recovery periods longer. And we want to have enough pastures to allow sufficient regrowth after recovery before being grazed again. I'll put on here on the PowerPoint, you'll see 35 to 45 plus. Early in the spring of the year when grass is growing fast, we can be around in 20 days is all the recovery period they need. That's a little bit too quick to come back, I think, with small ruminants because of the parasite issue that we're trying to manage. So usually, even with the small ruminants, I like to be off at least 30 to 40 days in the spring. And that's what helps with adding some cattle into the rotation as well. And we'll get into some more of that later on. Some of the main things that you got to consider and look at when you're thinking about designing a grazing system on your own place is how the land lays, the landscape, the topography. You need to know a little bit about your soils and the productivity of those, what forages are out there now, and then what forages might be needed later on to fill in the gaps. Livestock are you planning on? What livestock are you running now? What livestock are you planning on running in the future? Where existing water and fence is, and where we may need to add more water and fence to facilitate better grazing management. The thing that we always stress on grazing systems, they have to remain flexible. And the reason they have to be flexible is we've got so many variables that we're working with. Forage growth plants don't grow at the same speed every day out of the year. Forage growth varies throughout the year. So the plant recovery periods also must vary throughout the year. Our animal nutrient requirements vary throughout the year, depending on what stage of production they're in. Our herd size may change from year to year, depending on droughts and other things. And then life stuff happens. This is just showing schematically kind of the rest period needs throughout the grazing system season, the normal rainfall year. I will say, as dry as we've been in Southwest Missouri, that 35 to 45 days in August was going to be coming back too quick. We're going to start damaging some grass, and it's not going to come back. So creating flexibility in grazing systems, I think one of the best things that's happened in the last several years is the portable fencing and portable water systems, the advancement in both of those. And portable fencing, I'm talking about polywire, polytape, the electronet. And on portable water, I'm not talking about hauling water to them, but using some during the growing season, be able to use some of the black HDPE pipe that I've got shown there with the quick connect couplers that then we can put water in about any position in our pastures to a portable trough like is on the far right. One of the main things to help with the success of a grazing system is spending a lot of time thinking about water placement. And one of the key goals we try to do is try to keep the water within 800 feet of the livestock so that they don't have to travel over 800 feet and that they can maintain eye contact, because most grazing animals, if an animal has to go around a neck of woods, or if it's going to go out a gate and down a lane to get to water, they're going to go as a herd. And we lose some grazing distribution in our pasture. We also, when they're going up and down the lane to get to water, there's more manure distributed in the lane, which doesn't have any grass on it. And when the water's out in the pasture, they'll drink more water as well. This is just showing also with manure distribution, the closer we can keep those animals to water and the more uniform the grazing is in that pasture, the more uniform the nutrients are going to be distributed. And just, I want people to think about their grazing animals as four-legged fertilizer buggies without any steering. And it's our job as managers to put the steering on them by having the pasture sized right and having the water located right so they do a more uniform job grazing. And if they're doing a more uniform job grazing, they'll do a more uniform job spreading that manure instead of just putting it in two concentrated spots like in the upper up there. We've got water down there and there's a shade tree there, and most of the nutrients are getting redistributed there, whereas down here we've got more uniform spread over the entire paddock. Paddock shape does make a difference, and I know working in the Ozarks and living in the Ozarks for the last 30-something years, not every paddock can be square. We've got things we got to work with and things we got to work around, but the more nearly uniform in shape, the better off we're going to be. In this example, we're just showing some of the reasons for paddock shape. If we were going to make some 10-acre paddocks and we made square 10-acre paddocks and we were using, it would take 2,640 feet of fence to go around a square 10 acres. If we have triangle or rectangular paddocks, it would take 3,260 feet to go around it. And with the pie-shaped paddocks, 3,380. So you can see that can affect the cost of your startup. Also, the more nearly square as possible, it's usually easier to meet that travel distance to water rule. In this example, I've got the 4 green blocks represents a 40-acre block. I'm not saying this is the entire grazing system, but it could be one pasture of a grazing system that we're going to divide down into 4 10-acre paddocks. The one on the left is the 40 acres divided into 4 10-acre blocks with the water in the center of the 40. And with that one, our travel distance to water is under 800 foot at any point in any of those paddocks. The second one, and this is one we used a lot back in the early days before cost share was available and before we figured out what was going on, is we put the water lines down at the bottom and had long, narrow paddocks. And what we see in one like that is the front third of the paddock was getting overgrazed, the back third was getting underutilized, and the middle was about right. So that's not a real good design. I do still use that design with one slight modification. If we scooted that water line up to there and there, in the middle of those 2 lines, now we've reduced that travel distance to water back down to under the 800 feet that we were wanting. And we just gave ourselves a lot of flexibility, because if the water was centered on those 2 lines with poly wire or poly tape, I could convert that from a 4 paddock system to an 8 paddock system in a few minutes with very little added cost. And the pie-shaped paddocks on the far right work great out west, but they don't work great here. Out west, they're in a more arid environment. They don't get a lot of pugging. And here, where we get more rainfall, our soils are different. What you see with these is a pretty good zone of wear and tear that becomes a bare spot. And our job as grazing managers is to try to keep every square inch of ground covered with green leaves. Bare ground doesn't capture any sunlight and make livestock feed. And matter of fact, as the ground gets bare, we start getting erosion. We start losing some of our soil biology, because those bare spots will heat up to a higher temperature and kill a lot of the biology in the soil. So I try to stay away from the wagon wheel or pie-shaped paddocks as much as possible. This is showing the difference between a square paddock and the rectangular paddock, in that once we reconfigured the shape of that 10-acre paddock and put in square 660 by 660, we've got pretty much a flat line or pretty uniform grazing all across that paddock, as opposed to, and this line originally went up to here in that 60, came out here, and at about 800 feet, it starts to drop off. So by making them more nearly square, we can make that grazing more uniform. So I am an advocate for lanes in a grazing system. I think they make life easier for us as producers, make it easier and less stress on the livestock. And I'm probably also one of the reasons why a lot of people think they don't want lanes. Back before cost share was thought about, and some of our more progressive producers that were wanting to put in grazing systems, some of us old timers tried to make it as cheap for them as possible. And we looked at the way the land laid and broke it out based on landscape. Then we looked where existing water was and basically played connect the dots with lanes. Any pasture that didn't have water in it, they could go out the gate to the lane and go get water. Doing that, you know, livestock go up and down the lane anywhere from 2 to 5 times a day to get to drink. The lane becomes bare. If it's on a hillside, it starts to erode. If it's down in the bottom, it's going to stay muddy. So I don't like lanes for water. I like lanes for moving livestock from any paddock to any other paddock without having to go across another one. and to move them from any paddock to the working facilities without having to go through another paddock. And this, most of our grazing animals don't really like to go in the catch pen because the last time they were there, they either got dehorned, castrated, branded, something that didn't feel so good with a bunch of clanging metal, stressed out people, and a couple of barking dogs. And why do they want to go back? But if we can design this system so that in every rotation, we let those animals go through the catch pen without ever stopping, but go through a gate to another pasture of green grass, we can change their attitude about coming into the catch pen, and it makes life a whole lot easier to get them up and work them. So here's an example of the one that probably nobody has, a perfect a rectangular 80 with nothing in the way, and we've got the lane down the middle. And in this example, and these angle gates is one idea that we picked up from the New Zealanders when they came in and started putting in a grazing system for their dairies. In the past, ours had always been kind of straight-sided, but the angle gates does help a lot of animal movement better. And if you do have to get in there with a vehicle, it's easier to go in those angle gates than it is a 90-degree angle. But even in this one, if we had a gate from the working pens out into this pasture and a gate from the working pens out into that pasture, in every rotation, we could, instead of just turning them into that pasture, we could make them go through the working pens to go to green grass. So now every time, instead of thinking they're going to get shot, dehorned, or castrated or something like that, they're going through the working pens thinking they're going to green grass. So we want to plan the lanes for livestock movement only when watering points are in the lanes. 15 to 20% of the manure was deposited in the lanes. If we got the water out in the pasture, then animals will drink about 15% more water per day. When we're not using the lanes for water, then most of the erosion that we might see in the lanes is because we're out there in a truck or tractor running up and down the lane on days we shouldn't be running up and down the lane in a vehicle. So here's 3 different lanes, and people are always talking about how bare and what an eyesore lanes are. But if we're using them just for animal movement and people movement, they don't have to be bare. I maintain a lot of grass in my lanes, and periodically I shut the animals in the lane for a day, put portable water in the lane for them to graze down, because if they don't graze it, I'll have to mow it, and I'm cheap and lazy, and that's what I've got animals employed to do, is maintain the vegetation. Also, those of us that have worked in grazing systems for any number of years have kind of figured out that we really like the electric fencing over barbed wire or woven wire. It gives us a lot more flexibility. But electric fencing is a psychological barrier, not a physical barrier. So if it's a psychological barrier, that means we need to train our animals to respect electric fence. I've worked with producers with everything from geese to elephants, and I found we can train any class of livestock to respect electric fence. I have also found out there's going to be certain individual animals within any breed or any type of livestock that are untrainable. There's probably a few people that way. That's why I was never in management, because my advice is the ones that can't be trained need to be let go. I put wheels under them and send them to town. I'm not going to let one animal dictate to me how I can manage my operation. So what I'll do is, and a lot of you might not have to go to the detail I did, but I was buying goats way undervalued because somebody else couldn't keep them in. So they were used to getting out. So I had a catch pen that was a physical barrier that they physically couldn't get out of. Then I'll line the inside of it with a high tensile wire on offset brackets. And usually I would tie some aluminum foil strips along that fence on that high tensile wire. Most of our grazing animals are pretty curious. And what you'll see them doing is they see that little aluminum foil strip kind of fluttering in the wind and it's shiny. And they go over there and about the first thing they do is touch it with a wet nose or their tongue. And they get a pretty good indication of what the electric fence is all about when they touch it with the nose or the tongue. And I can put them in there and go back to the house. And if the working pins are close, just wait a while. There'll be a lot of abrupt bawling for a while, and then it quits. And when it quits, that means they all quit trying to touch the fence or those aluminum foil strips. And I move into phase 2. And in phase 2, I will cross fence it with poly wire. And I'll put the feed and water on one side of the poly wire and the animals on the other, because I want them to get shocked by that poly wire, because I'm going to be using poly wire out in the pasture to subdivide my permanent paddocks. And again, we'll go back through the process, some abrupt bawling, and then it will, at some point in time, it will quit and the animals will quit crossing that poly wire fence. Then I will make a gate like what it's going to look like out in the field, so I can train them that there is going to be a safe mode of passage to go in between those paddocks by going through the gate. But I want it to look like what it's going to look like in the field. When I get them to moving back and forth freely between there, then I take them out to pasture. Then anything that gets out goes to town. And when I'm doing this, I don't want I want my charger to be putting out its maximum possible. I don't want to kill anything. I just want to buckle their knees and water their eyes so that they remember what coming in contact with the fence is all about. And, you know, just open the gate, let them ease out, don't drive them out. And like I say, when animals didn't get trained, those are the ones that need to belong to somebody else. With electric fence, different species of livestock is going to require different numbers. For most, if you're just running cattle, you know, most of their interior cross fences can be just a single wire. Works well for cattle. If there may be some paddocks where we're going to be doing some across the fence weaning, that you may want to put up an extra wire or two to do the low stress across the fence weaning. With sheep and goats, my perimeter fence, it was 7-wire alternating hot and ground. And that doesn't take that many wires to keep the sheep and goats in, but my fence was part of my predator prevention. So the 7-wire fence, most of my interior fences could be 3 to 5 wire. 3-wire fence would work 90% of the time, except when I'm weaning those teenage buck kids and it's not quite time to sell them yet, but they're becoming sexually active. I've got to put them in a separate pasture. And I'm not going to put them up just in a dry lot. I like to keep them on pasture as much as possible. So in that situation, the 5-wire, I've got some paddocks of 5-wire, and the 5-wire paddocks are enough to keep them in. When everything's together, rotating through the system, and I'm further subdividing some permanent paddocks with poly wire, I can keep sheep and goats both behind 2 poly wires. You know, you can use the electronetting like was in one of my earlier slides, and it works great. The only thing for me, it's a little bit more costly, and it takes more time to put it up than it takes me to put out 2 rolls of poly wire if I've got my animals trained to respect it. Some animals, we need to think about a contingency plan in our grazing operation. Things happen. We need to think about adverse weather conditions. plan for those. A lot of, especially goats, goats tend to be a little worse than sheep and cattle as far as not liking to get wet. So they're going to be hunting for something to get under if it starts raining. That doesn't mean we have to have a barn in every paddock. We could put in some natural shelter and shade in each paddock possibly, or we could have some portable structures. One thing that we do need to think about is a sacrifice paddock for extremely wet conditions or extremely dry conditions. Most of the farms I've had in southern Missouri in the Ozarks have been hilly and rocky enough that they were never too wet that I had a lot of pugging problems, but they do get really dry in the summer times and the grass quits growing. We're still into that situation in southwest Missouri now. Looks like it may be going to rain the next few days. I hope so. But during drought, when the grass, we keep rotating at the speed of grass growth. Well, when grass flows really down, we have to extend that recovery period. And it may become a point in time to where it stops. Grass growth just kind of stops in these prolonged droughts, which is what it's done. Then we need to pick out a paddock. And I annually will look and pick out the worst paddock on the place, the one that's got more weeds and brush. It has to have shade. It has to have good water. And that will be my sacrifice paddock that year. And by putting them in there, more than likely, I'm going to have to feed them while they're in that paddock because they may be in there longer than a normal grazing period. So by bringing in hay and or feed, I'm also bringing in some fertilizer, which is going to help that paddock. And by them being in there for an extended period of time, even though I'm feeding them some hay, they're still going to nip on some of those weeds and brush and kill some of the weeds and brush. Whereas if I put them on my alfalfa and orchard grass field, they're going to kill alfalfa and orchard grass. So, and I don't like to use the same paddock each year. I just go around in the early spring and look, if things get rough, what paddock am I willing to sacrifice this year? And like I say, it's always what I consider to be the worst paddock that year. Now, as you move further north and get out of some of our rocks, in North Missouri, they have to have sacrifice paddocks for those extremely wet conditions and when that March thaw comes. When the March thaw comes in northern Missouri where there's not any rocks, the bottom falls out and those cows are dragging their belly. Everything you've got on pasture is dragging their bellies into the mud. Shelter from extreme cold and wet, we've talked about that. Now shade. Do livestock need shade? And when grazing school started back in 1990, Jim Garish had made the statement during grazing school that livestock need shade as much as we think they need shade. And I think that's a true statement. But as people went to grazing school and came back home into their counties, went to the coffee shop, and other farmers asked him, well, what'd you learn at that grazing school? And they said, well, that fool Jim Garish said cows don't need shade. That's not what he said. But we got to ask ourselves some questions. Are livestock going to be grazing end-of-fight infected fescue? And why does that make a difference? End-of-fight infected fescue constricts the vascular system and they can't regulate body temperature. So in the summertime, they're already going to be running a fever. Is the heat index going to be over 90? Have the livestock been selected for short hair coats and heat tolerance? Now, I will say I've worked with some producers in South Missouri that over a number of years, they don't have to worry about shade as much as probably most of the rest of us do because they've selected for animals that are a little more heat tolerant. There's plenty of good quality water present in that short travel distance. What's the overall condition of the animals? Already stressed animals are going to stress more with heat. And what are they accustomed to? So here's looking at the heat index chart. When we're over here in the bright yellow, we need to be watching them pretty close. And they may start stressing in those temperatures. When they get into this, they need to have shade available. And there's the good and the bad of shade. As one of my previous slides showed, a lot of times in the pasture, especially if our pastures are a little too big, and they've got water and shade, a lot of times our manure, our fertilizer coming out the back end of these fertilizer buggies is going to be deposited mainly around the water source and around the shade. And if we're real kind to our animals and put the water next to the shade and have our minerals right up there by the shade, it's kind of like what I call the pool hall effect. It's like having your beer and pretzels in that comfortable environment with a bunch of friends, and why are you going to leave? They're going to about have to run you out at closing time. Well, the same thing's happening to the animals. So in that situation, at least have your minerals located in another spot in the pasture and the water further away from the shade, so that they do have to get up and move around some to get to those needs throughout the day. You can see some portable shade structures here. I had some little lightweight, I only had one paddock on my place that didn't have shade or didn't have ample shade, especially when I was using the poly wire to cut it down. And I had some little homemade portable huts that I'd made that I could put out there. I've had some other things. You can see here the one on the picture on the lower left is homemade. That's one that was at the Southwest Research Center at Mount Vernon. There was no shade on any of those dairy paddocks. And that, I know MU's got plans for these. They may not be available in the office, but you can pull them off the web, or they can pull them off for you. That's just welded together pipe with greenhouse shade cloth stretched over the top, and they're kind of put on the pipe skids. And the cost of, I don't know the exact cost. It just depends on how much of that stuff you've got available and what all you've got to work with. Natural shade. Sometimes some of the farms I've had on pastures that didn't have shade, then I would move the animals twice a day. Before I went to work in the morning, I would put them on a paddock that had shade in it to do their daytime grazing. Then late in the afternoon, I would put them on the paddock that didn't have any shade to do their nighttime grazing. That way it allowed me to use that paddock before it got too mature, because I don't cut hay. I buy all my own hay. So I'm not going to go out there and cut it for hay, but I can still graze it during that critical time. They are a lot of manufactured shade structures. The one on the bottom right, it is pretty expensive. I know some producers in Missouri use them, saying they're paying off, but they are pretty expensive. So how many paddocks do I need? Not everybody's going to need the same number of paddocks, depending on what your goals are, what your time availability is, what type of livestock you're running, and what kind of performance you want out of them. And it depends on the length of the recovery period needed by the grasses, the plants. The formula is down on the bottom. The recovery period divided by the grazing period plus the number of herds or flocks that you're going to be running through the system. And if you're running everything, even with multi-species, when you've got everything together, that would be 1. But if you've got cows in one pasture, sheep in one pasture, and goats in another pasture, that's going to be times 3. So the more times you divide those out, the more paddocks it's going to take. The recovery periods provide time for recovery of forage plants. They maintain our soil health and break up those heavy use points and break the parasite cycles. And that's the one thing with our small ruminants I try to manage, use management as a lot of my parasite prevention program. And the longer the rest period, if we can get that 40 days in between, it's a lot better than coming back too quick. From the forage standpoint, during rapid growth in the spring and April, from the time the first pasture's been grazed till it's ready to be grazed again, a lot of times is somewhere between 15 and 20 days. Then May, it gets to 20 to 30, June 30 to 40, and then we get into July and August 40 to 60, and sometimes longer than 60, depending on the dry, how dry it gets and how plants are growing. And this is kind of that schematic of how our grasses grow throughout the year, looking at a cool season base with some annual Lespedeza, red clover, and white clover. So if we were grazing just based on our plant goals to maintain good, healthy plants in the pasture, then we don't want to graze the regrowth during the same grazing period. That's when we start setting grass back and eventually killing it. So in the spring of the year, we'd never want to be in a pasture over 5 days, somewhere between 2 and 5 days, or 1 and 5 days, actually. And because sometimes that grass may be coming back in 3 days, but at least in 5 days, there's going to be enough regrowth that they're going to go back over there and start biting it off again and letting some of the plants ahead of them get too mature that they continue to refuse. And those where they keep hammering, that's where we see that spot grazing in the pasture, overgrazed and undergrazed in the same pasture. That's because the pasture is too big and they've been in there too long and they get to do that selective grazing. So we're wanting to cut that down by cutting the pasture sizes down. We're also talking about the animals. It's not just about the plants. And the higher nutrient requiring animals that we're running, the more often we ought to be moving them. With grass-based dairy and grass-based beef finishing, those animals have high nutrient needs. We're trying to maintain either gains or milk production. They need to be moved at a minimum of once a day. Most of the time, those are being moved at least twice a day. With our growing and fattening animals like stockers, dairy heifers, maybe our kids or lambs that we've got on pasture, then if we could move them every 1 to 2 days, it's where on these growing and fattening animals, I got my best gains. It wasn't that they were losing weight on day 3, but they weren't gaining at the rate they were on day 1 and day 2. Because every day we're in the pasture, they're taking it down a little bit. So bite size gets reduced a little bit. Also, forage quality in the pasture is dropping every day they're in there. With our regular lactating beef cattle, sheep, goats, and horses, having a system set up to where we could rotate every 2 to 5 days would work pretty well. Gives us that flexibility. So looking at the math of it, this guy says he went to grazing school and says he wants to rotate every 3 days. Well, in the spring of the year, planning for a 20-day rest period, 3 into 20 plus 1, you'd need 8 paddocks to do that. Now we get to the summertime, and even on a good summer, we're probably going to need about a 45-day rest period. So 3 into 45 plus 1 is 16. So how are we going to do that? Well, if we had that 8 paddock grazing system and we did a good job with our water placement and using potentially some above ground water with some portable tanks, we could divide those 8 paddocks into 16 with some polywire pretty quick at a very low cost. And that would allow us to give longer rest periods to our plants. The other way is to keep them in each paddock a little longer. And that seems contrary to what we think, but when grass is growing fast, we're trying to move fast to stay up with the grass, because grass is trying to get ahead of us in the spring. In the summertime, then by doing that, we're not necessarily taking half and leaving half like we talk about all the time. In that first grazing or 2 through in the spring, we may only be taking a third. We're trying to just top those plants to keep them from going reproductive too soon. We want to keep them vegetative. Then as we get into the summer, we've created some vegetative regrowth. And now we can start staying in there until we do the take half and leave half, and maybe instead of staying 3 days, stay 5 days. We either have to have flexible paddock numbers or flexible grazing periods. They both can't be static because our grasses are not growing at the same speed. So when you put the math to it, and I put it in this chart, if we got dairy or grass-based beef finishing throughout the growing season, they're going to be using somewhere between 20 to 80 paddocks. And most of them don't have 80 permanent paddocks. They're going to have probably 20 permanent paddocks that get divided down multiple times for those daily moves. Dairy heifers and stockers, I like the 1 to 2 day grazing period, and we can make somewhere between 16 to 32 paddocks work for that. Cow, calf, sheep, and goats, where we can have those 2 to 5 day grazing periods, somewhere between 8 to 16 paddocks could make that work. I tend to like that 10 or a 12 paddock system. I've used quite a bit, and I tend to like at least 10 paddocks, and 12's a little better. But even with some 8 paddock systems, if we've got polywire and we did a good job with our water distribution, we can make as many paddocks as we want temporarily. So the economic impact of rotational and management intensive grazing, we get increased forage utilization. We're able to extend the grazing season, increase stocking rates, and potentially greater average daily gains. Some of our decreased cost is hopefully we don't have to feed as much hay, because every day we can graze, we're saving money over feeding hay. Feeding hay is always at least twice as expensive as grazing. If we're doing a better job spreading our manure, then at some point in time, we should be able to reduce our fertilizer needs. And if we're using multi-species grazing, we should be able to keep our weed control costs down and actually get paid for weed control. So rotational grazing, and I'm going to kind of show the difference between typical rotational grazing and then what we call management intensive grazing. Rotational grazing would be where you've got somewhere between 4 and 7 paddocks that we're staying in there a little longer. It does allow some rest periods. It gives some control over the grazing heights, but the problem that I see with those, the grazing periods are long enough, especially in the spring, that they're going to get that second bite. And at that 4 to 7 paddock system, usually we're only somewhere between 35 and 45% utilization efficiency. When we go to management intensive, that's when you get from 8 to 24 and on up. We've got more control over the quantity and quality of forage on offer to our animals. We get enhanced forage utilization, improved manure distribution. The persistence of the plants increase because they're getting more rest, and we're managing for greater forage health. It extends our grazing season, and the utilization rate is going to be somewhere between 50 and 70%, as opposed to 30 to 45%. So now we're going to go through, with the time, a little time that's left, maybe in 5 minutes, looking at an exercise of, here's a 140 acre pasture that's based loosely on a real life example that we used out of the Linnaeus area. We had a pond in it when it was up there. Right now we're saying this is South Missouri, and we've got a well right there, and we've got a water trough right there. And right now that's the only water on that. There's a fence around the outside edge, no cross fencing, and the maximum travel distance to water is 2,000 feet. So we're going to look at how the land lays, and here's a topography map. And you can see we've got this steep slope down in the lower right. We've got a gentle slope along the left-hand side, and then we've got some bottom land there in the middle. So if we separated those 3 landscapes out, is where we would first start. If we combine some of this steep slope in with that bottom land, our grass is always growing faster in the bottom land than it is on that steep slope. What people think is that we're going to get overgrazing in the bottom land. What the grazing animals tell us, we're going to get overgrazing on the steep slope where the grass is growing slower, and we're going to get spot grazing down in the bottom land. Because every time we turn them into that pasture, the grass is going to be a little bit ranker in the bottom than it is on that steep slope. They're going to choose that less mature, shorter grass on the steep slope. They're going to go lay down in the bottom. And when they stand up, they're just bringing fertility from the steep slope down to the bottom. And we don't get as good a utilization. So we try to separate those different areas out by productivity. We'll look at a fixed system first. The advantages on low cost on large operations, minimal daily labor, lower maintenance. It's higher cost on small operations, gives us more limited management flexibility. And here's just kind of showing that if we compare the cost of putting a 10 paddock system in on 40 acres as opposed to a 10 paddock system on 400 acres, the cost per acre is going to be a lot greater on the 40 acres. Yeah, the 400 acres is going to have to buy more wire and more posts, but we're going to have the same number of gates, gate post, end post, angle bracing, underground wire, and everything that it takes to make the system work. So here's that 140 acres. We've separated the bottom from the steep slope and then had this gentle slope separated off by itself. And if that was divided into half, then we would have that basic 4-pasture rotational grazing system. That is the bare bones minimum it would take to get into any of the cost share programs for developing a grazing system. And what I tell people is don't stop there. At that level, we're taking care of the environmental problems. We can keep enough grass that we reduce soil erosion. We've probably got enough grass that we're catching the pollutants that are trying to go to the ponds, creeks, and streams, but we haven't put any money back in our pockets. We haven't improved utilization or stretched out the grazing days. So here's an 8-paddock system, and in that system, the problem with it is we're still using the lane to get to water. And we're not going to get good utilization out of some of these paddocks at the furthest point away from that water. So here is one way to do it. I think this would be the bare bones, a minimum of amount of waters that it would take to have some pretty decent distribution of waters on that place where each of these waters are serving multiple paddocks. So that would be 3 waters. In some cases, our travel distance might still be pushing over that 800 feet. Now then we added, and this is what I talk about in grazing schools quite a bit, with cost share, if there's a water available in those paddocks, then they're not also going to cost share on a hydrant and a portable tank or a quick connect coupler and a portable tank. But while the ditch is open and they're paying for all the pipeline, the ditch, the backfilling and all that, at your own cost, scatter some hydrants or some of those quick connect couplers around so that you got flexibility in being able to put water about anywhere in those paddocks so you can further subdivide from time to time. There's going about it another way with more permanent tanks, which we like them in these divided out here rather than in the lane, and they still get utilized by at least 2 pastures. Now we'll look at a flexible system. Here's that same 140 acres, and the red lines are the permanent high tensile wire fence. It's not going to be moved. And if this was during the growing season or on a rent farm that we're only going to be using during the growing season, or our pastures that we don't use in wintertime, we could have it set up like this. This is our portable water line right under the fence line with those quick connect couplers on it. We can divide it. We can move them every day, every other day. If we have to be gone for a week, we can give them a week's worth of grass and still have water and grass available. Gives us a lot of flexibility, and to the best of my ability on the computer, I tried to keep those lines at about 660 feet apart, because then when we start using polywire, we know we're not maxing out on the 800, and you can put up and take down polywire pretty quickly on 660 foot. There's kind of a hybrid where if we wanted some of our fields that we were going to cut for hay, or say they were warm season grass fields that we weren't going to be grazing in April and May, we could leave them big, subdivide them with polywire, and use portable water out in them once we put them back in the grazing system. So how are we doing on time? One more deal. Here's a grazing system that I put together on one farm with specific for managing internal parasites, and that would be a central lane. And instead of having everything running together, I had the sheep and goats running together, going down here at the time it took that they completed a cycle here, but instead of them going back up here, the sheep and goats would go over to this side. The cows would come down here. The cows come back up here. We've got regrowth. So then the cows would be following, and that would double the length of time before the sheep and goats come back into that same pasture, and should drastically reduce the worm load that they could be picking up on pasture. That and grazing taller with sheep and goats. I don't like to graze closer than about 4 to 5 inches to the ground. And I think that's the end.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that great presentation. There are a few questions just in the chat box. You were talking about the lane and the gate. Somebody asked you, can you just go and read it to save time? Can you see those questions, Matt?
Those were on most of the examples I'm showing are using electric fence, but that could have, you could have your woven wire fence if that's what you're going to be using for your permanent paddock subdivisions. But that angle still, it's easier to get your truck or a tractor in there if you need to, and animal flow is a lot better. The other thing that I meant to mention on that particular slide is where you've got that central lane, having a gate on each end of that paddock greatly helps. Because if it's in on the wrong end and your mature animals know the game, and they know when you open that gate which way to go up or down the lane, but the babies see mom turn up the lane, they stay on the fence, on the other side of the fence, trying to follow her up the lane, and then they get balled up in the corner that doesn't have a gate. So when you're taking them one direction, go out the gate closest to that direction, the other direction out the gate that way. It adds a little bit of cost to the overall design, but I think it sure makes life a lot easier.
So, Mark, do you alternate your fencing? Are your 5-wire fences also alternating grand and hard?
Do what?
Yeah, there's a question that says, are your 5-wire fences also alternating grand and out, or all out? You mentioned about your fencing.
Generally on the 5-wire fence, it will, and even on my 3-wire high tensile fence, my permanent fences, I use those alternating hot and ground. For the internal cross fences, the main reason for keeping them alternating is when we get into this real dry weather like we got right now in some parts down here, we don't get good earth return ground. So they're still going to get shocked if they're having to touch 2 wires to get through the fence. With the on my 7-wire fence, the other added advantage for that is on predator protection. if they're all hot and predators can jump, or they can get through it without getting shocked. And then we start having a predator problem. So if they're alternating hot and ground, even if they're airborne, they're going to get shocked.
So do you want to make a comment on your flock size or paddock size? Do you want someone to please comment on your size or paddock size?
Paddock size is going to depend, and that's something we get into, and I'd encourage people to go, if they haven't been to a grazing school, to go. We get into the grazer's mouth there, but paddock size is going to depend on your overall herd size, how many animals you're running. And what I try to do is not have more on my permanent paddocks, not have more than, say, a week's worth of grass, because I always want to move them at least every 5 days. But if I had to be gone for an emergency or something, I could be gone up to 7 days. But when I'm home, to improve the efficiency of that system, that's where the poly wire comes out, and I can further subdivide those 7-day paddocks into 2-3-day or divide them 2 or 3 times there to get that grazing period down under what I want it based on the speed of grass growth.
Oh, great. So, Mark, what about the fact that, there's a leader-follower concept in multi-species grazing? So do you suggest producers should turn out the cow first to graze, or they can mix them together, to control parasite, on the pasture?
I've done it different ways, and depending on, I guess, my objectives at the time, what I was wanting to do with the pasture. Also, I look at which animal has the highest nutrient requirement now and give them first choice. The one, so a lot of times, the cows may go first if they were during that peak lactation period of time, and other times the sheep and goats may go first. A lot of times, depending on how much brush species was in the paddock, a lot of times I might send the goats through first to reduce some of the brush so the cows could get closer to some of that. It increased their grazing area if they took out some of the brush ahead of the cows. And then sheep, I could do either way.
Excellent. Mark, do you want to read the next question from Nicole? I don't want to take time. Do you see that question from Nicole in the chat box? He's asking, are there any good options for keeping frost free water for goats? Can you see the question?
I've not, I think I've used tire tanks where you have to have an overflow pipe in the tire tank with that trickle valve that you can open up in the wintertime, so you get a trickle flow of water through there to keep it from freezing as bad. I've not had any experience, and I've seen them in the magazines. I've not talked to anybody that's used the drinking post water. I do know that one of the, we'll say, ball top waters, I know Richie has one that instead of being a ball that's harder for sheep and goats to push down, and it is shorter also, has a disc that's more flat, and it's easier for them to drink out of that. And I've had another tank, that even an open top tank that was a concrete tank that you could open the valve and they get the trickle flow of water through it. You got to take that water, have an overflow pipe to take it away from that area. On some of those open top tanks, especially with sheep and goats, you're probably going to need to put something in there so that if they fall in or kids and lambs jump in, they can jump back out before they drown. That even helps with calves, because calves don't really jump in it, but they go up there with moms, get knocked in it, and they can't get back out, and they'll drown.
Okay, we're going to take the last question. Do you ever need to receive your sacrifice paddock? Do you need to receive?
Some, yeah, sometimes I may have to, but I'm reseeding only one as opposed to if I kept the rotation up during a drought like we've had this year and in some years, I'd have to reseed about all of them. But yes, sometimes because to start with, it was the worst one anyway. It had a thinner stand of grass.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for listening to our MU extension Smyrna webinar for October. We're going to have the last one for 2024 in November, and we're going to send the information. Mark, thank you so much for making it possible for us to share some of your thoughts and experience on grazing system for sheep and goat. Thank you so much for joining, and we're going to send the video recording and all the materials to you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach us at the email davidbrown@missouri.edu. davidbrown@missouri.edu. All right. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and stay blessed. Bye.
Bye.